So I'd like to just start by, again, welcoming everybody to today's online book launch of the new publication from Mehring Books entitled Pike River, The Crime and Cover-Up. My name is Max Boddy. I'm the Assistant National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia. It is with great pleasure that I chair today's book launch. We have an important lineup of speakers, and I really do encourage as much discussion and questions as possible as the time will allow. The disaster at Pike River coal mine, located on the Paparoa mountain range on New Zealand's South Island, is a crime for which nobody has been held accountable. On November 19th, 2010, the underground mine exploded. 31 workers were underground at the time and 2 escaped, with 29 others trapped. 3 additional explosions over subsequent days left no hope of survivors. 29 workers lost their lives. This was roughly 11% of the workforce at the mine, including contractors. The victims include 24 New Zealanders, 1 South African man, 2 men from Australia and 2 men from Scotland. One of the victims was just 17 years old. These deaths were all preventable. The revelations following the explosions revealed the substandard conditions of the mine. It began operation before appropriate infrastructure was put in place. The drive for coal production outweighed the lives and safety of the workers. Despite the damning evidence, nobody has been held to account. In fact, as the book details, a major cover-up operation was carried out. Within days of the first explosion, Labor politicians and the media jumped into action. They claimed, without evidence, that the company operating the mine, that is Pike River Coal, were not at fault. Later, some tried to blame the workers for the explosion, saying they allowed the unsafe conditions. In truth, the explosion was the result of the deregulation of safety standards by successive governments, both Labor and National, with the complicity of the unions who functioned as accomplices of Pike River Company. A particular focus of the book is the role of the right-wing Jacinta Ardern Labor government. It was able to carry out what the Nationals could not and seal the mine, preventing the gathering of bodies or forensic evidence. The Pike River mine disaster demonstrates the policy of capitalism and capitalist governments the world over, the sacrifice of workers' lives for profit. This is no more hideously expressed than in the continuing COVID-19 pandemic, which has been allowed to spread unchecked in virtually every country. The official global death toll stands above 6.3 million. However, due to inadequate testing and reporting, experts believe the number could be as high as 20 million. Capitalist governments have demonstrated they are willing to let tens of millions die of a preventable disease. They claim nothing can be done to eliminate the virus because it would be too expensive, and any disruption to business activity would crash the stock market. Workers are being told they must sacrifice not only their living standards, but their health and lives, so that the world's richest can increase their fortunes. And a recent Oxfam report revealed that over the first 2 years of the pandemic, a new billionaire was minted on average every 30 hours. The experiences in both Australia and New Zealand have sharply expressed this process. In both countries, COVID-19 was effectively eliminated through limited mitigation measures. Now it is spreading unchecked as the homicidal let-it-rip policies have been embraced. In Australia, on average, 40 people die a day, 11 of which are in aged care facilities. The death rate is currently 6 times higher than at the end of 2021, with daily cases exceeding 30 and sometimes 50,000. In New Zealand, the Ardern Labor government has lifted almost all restrictions and told the world during her US visit that the pandemic is over. Now hospitals are swamped and unable to deliver basic services as more than 10 people are dying each day with COVID. In other words, every 3 days, the equivalent of the Pike River death toll is inflicted on families across the country. In addition to the pandemic, there is the threat of World War III. The United States and NATO are already engaged in a brutal proxy war with Russia, using Ukraine as the staging ground and its people as cannon fodder. Plans are also far advanced for war against China. and the Labor governments of both Australia and New Zealand are placing workers on the front line of a possible nuclear war in the Pacific as they function as the attack dog of the United States in the region. The pandemic has proven that no level of death is unacceptable in the pursuit of profit. So too with war. The US and its allies are escalating the situation, even though they are well aware that the conflict can quickly turn into a nuclear war that would kill millions. The banks and major corporate heads and their political servants are fixated on only one thing: gaining control over the world's most important markets, natural resources, and cheap labor. The same brutal, single-minded drive for profit caused the Pike River disaster. Speaking to us today is Tom Peters, the main author of the book and member of the Socialist Equality Group, or SEG, in New Zealand. The SEG is a section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, as is the SEP in Australia. Within 3 days of the explosion, Tom wrote an article on the World Socialist website, pointing to the emerging cover-up and the broader international context of the disaster. Just to quote that article, he wrote, "Far from being a random or natural catastrophe, the information that is emerging points to the explosion at the Pike River coal mine, like recent mine disasters in the US, Chile, and China, being the result of entirely man-made factors, the compromising and sacrifice of miners' health and safety on the altar of corporate profit," end quote. Since then, the SEG has published approximately 70 articles about Pike River on the World Socialist website, as well as more than 100 statements from readers in New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Sri Lanka, demanding a full investigation into the disaster. The SEG has also held 2 public meetings on the disaster. This will be the third. The first was held just 1 month after the disaster on December 16th, 2010. There, the speakers warned that neither the government nor the Labor Party had any intention of holding anyone accountable. Now, not a single other political organisation has conducted such a campaign on this decisive and tragic experience of the New Zealand working class. His book that we're launching today contains 20 of the more recent articles, interviews and speeches, as well as speeches from the second public meeting held almost a year ago. Some of these pieces have been significantly revised and expanded. And in addition to Tom Peters, we also have 3 other speakers today: Bernie Monk, a well-known advocate for the Pike River families; Malcolm Bray, a retired coal miner from the United Kingdom; and Terry Cook, who will speak on recent mining disasters and the case for rank and file committees. After the reports, we'll open up for questions and discussion, after which we'll make some announcements and give you all the details on when you can purchase this important book. So to begin with, I'd like to introduce Tom Peters, author of Pike River, The Crime and Cover-Up. He's been a regular writer for the World Socialist website since 2008 and leads the work of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. In addition to regularly writing on Pike River, he covers New Zealand politics, workers' struggles, the fight against war, the COVID pandemic, and many other historical and cultural issues. So with that, I'd like to give Tom a very warm welcome.
Thanks very much, Max. I'm very pleased to be here today and to talk about this disaster. The series of underground explosions in Pike River Mine, which killed 29 workers, was not a random accident. There's now overwhelming evidence that Pike River coal had extremely unsafe, life-threatening, and illegal practices. The mine had no proper emergency exit, which is a legal requirement, and its methane gas monitoring and ventilation systems were totally inadequate. The main fan was installed underground, something that is never done in coal mines because of the high risk that it will break down and cause sparks. The mine, in short, was a gas bomb waiting to go off. A Royal Commission of Inquiry produced a report in late 2012 which said, quote, "In the last 48 days before the explosion, there were 21 reports of methane levels reaching explosive volumes and 27 reports of lesser but potentially dangerous volumes. The reports of excess methane continued up until the very morning of the tragedy. The warnings were not heeded. That equates to 1 safety breach per day. As Max said, management's all-consuming focus was to produce coal, to start making a profit and a return for its shareholders, and to repay the company's massive debt. I will cite just one of the early warnings made by Harry Bell, a former chief mining inspector who did some work as a contractor for Pike River in its development. He told the Royal Commission that he had told a Department of Labour official in late 2008, after a series of underground ignitions in the mine, quote, "Stop them bloody mining until they fix the ventilation." He had also warned the mine's technical manager that it was, quote, "nonsensical madness to go through the fault with a single drive entry because of the gas risk." The Royal Commission concluded that the Department of Labour, the regulatory agency, should have prohibited Pike from operating, but it took no action. Neither did the Engineering, Printing and Manufacturing Union, which had about 70 members at Pike River. The union knew all about the dangers, but said nothing prior to the disaster and allowed the workers to continue going underground day after day. Pike River must rank as one of the most blatant examples of corporate criminality in New Zealand and in the history of mining internationally. But this is more than just a story of greedy and corrupt individuals, although there is certainly plenty of that involved. This disaster and the cover-up, which continues more than 11 years later, are a devastating exposure of the criminality of capitalism and of all the parliamentary parties, the state agencies, and trade unions which exist to uphold and justify a system that values profit over human lives. Following the 2012 Royal Commission, even Prime Minister John Key from the National Party was forced to admit that Pike River coal, quote, "put its profits and its production ahead of the safety and lives of those 29 workers." But that raises the obvious question, which no one in his government or the current Labour government can answer. Why has nobody been held to account for actions that led to 29 deaths? Instead, there's been a conscious operation to prevent anyone being prosecuted, in which all the parliamentary parties, the unions, the regulators, and the courts are complicit. This cover-up began before the explosion, when the EPMU remained silent about the conditions in the mine, even after a group of miners walked out to protest the lack of emergency equipment. The union allowed the company to continue lying that it had an impeccable safety record, ensuring that workers kept going underground and there was no disruption to its operations. After the initial explosion, Andrew Little, who was then the union leader and also the Labour Party president at the time, rushed to defend the company. Pike River had, quote, "an active health and safety committee. The union's well represented on it. There's nothing unusual about Pike River or this mine that we've been particularly concerned about," he told the New Zealand Herald. He similarly told Radio New Zealand, "Every mine on the West Coast takes great care when it goes into production, and I don't think Pike River is any different to that." The union, which is now called Air2, has the following slogan on its website: "Empowering working people and our communities for a better life." In my opinion, they should change that to "Nothing unusual about Pike River, nothing to be concerned about," because that reflects much more accurately the role that the union actually plays, to disempower and suppress workers and to uphold company profits. The corporate media and politicians, including members of the Greens, the Progressive Party, the ACT Party, Labour and National, fell over themselves to praise Pike River CEO Peter Whittle as someone who cared deeply about his workers. We quote some of their fawning statements in the book following the disaster. Green MP Kevin Haigh stood up in Parliament and said, "I'll single out Peter Whittle. I will take this public opportunity to convey the Green Party's thanks, our enormous sympathy, but also our tremendous respect for the integrity, responsibility, and compassion that he has unfailingly shown." The Progressive Party's Jim Anderton similarly declared that Peter Whittle had shown calm, intelligent leadership and great strength at a difficult time. Labour Party leader Phil Goff praised the CEO for carrying an incredible responsibility and strain. The well-known broadcaster Mark Sainsbury said on national TV that Peter Whittle had earned the respect of all around him for his calm, measured handling of what is almost an impossible situation. Peter Whittle was then invited to speak at the public memorial service alongside Prime Minister John Key and the Governor-General, posing as a great friend to all miners and promising to do everything possible to get the men's bodies out. They couldn't keep this charade going for long. Evidence started to come out in the media and later in the Royal Commission hearings about the horrific conditions that Peter Whittle and the rest of his management had presided over. Following the inquiry, Whittle was charged with violating health and safety regulations, but he remained protected. In 2013, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, which included the Department of Labour, agreed to drop all 12 of the charges against Whittle. In exchange, he made an unsolicited payment to the victims' families, which many of whom denounced the payment as blood money. John Key defended this deal, telling the media that a trial of Peter Whittle would have cost millions and millions of dollars, and there was no guarantee of a successful prosecution anyway. But this backroom agreement was finally ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court in 2017. However, the charges were not reinstated and nobody in the Key government or the Department of Labour faced any consequences for perverting the course of justice. Meanwhile, John Key kept telling the families that his government would do everything possible to re-enter the mine and to recover the bodies. But in November 2014, just 2 months after the National Party had been re-elected, the state-owned company Solid Energy, which had acquired Pike River mine, cancelled its re-entry plan, claiming that it was too dangerous to go back in. When the national government then tried to seal the mine in late 2016, it was stopped by a determined campaign in opposition from the majority of the families and their supporters, who organised independently of the political parties and the unions and protested on the road to the mine. The Labour Party, however, has achieved last year what National was not able to do. After carrying out a manned re-entry of the drift tunnel, that is the entrance into the mine, the 2.3 kilometre tunnel, the Ardern government refused to go any further into the mine workings. It has now permanently sealed the mine, preventing the recovery of crucial evidence and of human remains. The question is, how did this happen? Labour and its allies, the Green Party and New Zealand First, all campaigned in the 2017 election with a promise to re-enter the mine's drift in order to properly investigate the causes of the explosions, with the aim of retrieving bodies and mounting a prosecution. And this video of Andrew Little shows what he said while he was in opposition and what the Labour Party promised. I'd just like to play that video now.
Is he going to keep John Key's promise and do everything he can to get the bodies out?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is a question of whether it is safe to get the bodies out without putting other lives at risk.
When he says it should be up to the experts to determine whether re-entering the mine is safe, is he aware a report saying re-entry is safe has been written by Dr. David Creedy, Vice Chair of the UN Group of Experts on Coal Mine Methane, and Bob Stevenson, former UK Principal Mines Inspector, and that report has been peer-reviewed and endorsed by the United Kingdom's leading mines rescue expert Brian Robinson and by mining ventilation experts John Rowland and Dr. Roy Morby. Why doesn't he do the right thing, listen to the families and fulfil his government's promise to do everything he can to get their men out?
That's a very clear statement that the Labour Party used while in opposition, which led the families to believe that they would seriously consider entering the mine workings in order to retrieve the bodies. And then further, after the Labour government was installed, it issued this cabinet paper in November the 20th, 2017, which stated, quote, "At a point when the process of recovering the drift is well advanced, the responsible minister will report to cabinet on whether any further work to assess the feasibility of re-entering the mine workings should be undertaken." It also said the new Pike River Recovery Agency would establish a trusted relationship with the families and would proactively engage with the families in its decision-making processes, taking full account of information and expertise that the families bring to the process. Jacinda Ardern, the Labour Party's new leader, was being heavily promoted at the time in the media, both here and internationally. And she used every opportunity to declare that she was going to lead a government based on kindness and empathy. She personally reached out to members of the Pike River families and told them that she was their friend. This had an effect. Many of the families believed that Labour would be different and would honour its commitments. They were cruelly betrayed. We warned on the World Socialist website that the government would continue to protect the company and the state and union that paved the way for the disaster. It was no accident that the Minister for Pike River Re-entry is Andrew Little. To say that this was a conflict of interest is an understatement. He was the one who had defended Pike River coal when he was the EPMU leader from the beginning. Now his job was to permanently bury the evidence. Labour set out to do this. Labour set out to bring the families under control, to put an end to their independent organisation, to divide them from each other, and to isolate them from the broader working class. The claim that the Pike River Recovery Agency would work in partnership with the families, which is still emblazoned on the agency's website, is a lie. The family reference group that was established as part of the agency was an unelected body consisting of just 3 family members and 2 advisors, Rob Egan and Tony Sartorius. Just a word about one of these advisors, Rob Egan. He's a former advisor to 2 Labour Party leaders, and he's the co-founder of a public relations firm called Pico Consulting. Pico's website includes this boast, quote, "We have extensive experience in successful crisis management and are experts in taking a potential public relations loss and turning it into a win for you and your organization," end quote. That was the job that was given to these individuals, these PR people, to spin the message that the government was on the side of the families, even as it proceeded to go beyond the cover-up and prepared to close down the mine and put an end to the investigation forever. In March last year, Andrew Little made the shock announcement that the mine was going to be sealed permanently after the drift had been recovered, without assessing whether it was possible to enter the mine workings. The bodies would never be recovered, and the underground fan, which may well have sparked the explosion, would not be forensically examined. The family reference group issued a statement saying that the families accepted this decision. But here is where the government's spin machine ran into trouble. The vast majority of the families objected that the FRG did not speak for them. 23 of the families, 80% of them, organised independently in the Pike River Families Committee, which demanded that the government reconsider its decision. They were supported by world-renowned mining experts, led by Tony Forster, the former Chief Inspector of Mines, and mines rescue expert Brian Robinson, and David Creedy, an expert on methane gas. These experts, who had previously been praised by Andrew Little in the video that we just saw, and who had worked for the government on its re-entry of the drift, produced a new plan for how the mine workings could be accessed using steel supports, which is a standard mining technique. And they made the comment that this should have been done years ago. Brian Robinson, who Andrew Little once referred to as the UK's leading mine rescue expert, wrote a letter to the Pike River Recovery Agency's Chief Executive Dave Gawn, which is included in my book, where he described the decision to seal the mine and walk away as, quote, morally and professionally indefensible. The government rejected the experts' plan, stating at various times that it was too expensive or that it couldn't be done safely, a claim that was never substantiated. Much of the book focuses on the families' campaign against the Ardern government. That included this online petition, which gained more than 6,600 signatures and stated, if they seal the mine now, they will lock away that critical evidence forever, and with it any chance of finding out what happened, of holding those responsible to account, and of making sure it never happens again. We must not let them do it. In June, the families attempted to challenge the government's decision in the High Court. And last July, they organised a protest on the road to the mine, demanding that the Labour government listen to the experts. While the media reported very little about these events, the World Socialist website provided extensive coverage, exposing the government's misinformation campaign, and we called upon the working class in New Zealand and internationally to intervene and to help stop the mine being sealed. There was a very significant response. We received many messages of support, some of which are included in the book. The trade unions opposed the families' fight and sided with the government. Air2 National Secretary Bill Newson told me that the union, quote, supports the government's position regarding not re-entering the mine. The government responded to the families' campaign by doubling down and insisting that sealing the mine was non-negotiable. On May 12 last year, Andrew Little bluntly told News Hub that the government had already, quote, delivered justice for the families. And he added that, quote, when you're in government, you've got to weigh up competing priorities. For me, my priority now is the living, end quote. Kath Monk, whose son Michael died in Pike River, said to me about this, Little was National Secretary of the EPMU back in 2010. He should have been as concerned about the living back then. Olivia Monk, Michael's sister, wrote a powerful statement in response to the government, which I urge everyone to read. She pointed out, quote, no one has been held accountable for the 29 men's deaths. No one has taken responsibility. No one has learned anything from this. And no one has any consequence if this happens again. We just keep killing people at work. The police investigation, we are told, is continuing. Police suspended their initial investigation in 2013, declaring that the mountain of evidence from the Royal Commission was not enough to prosecute anyone, and they needed actual physical evidence from inside the mine to show the precise cause of the explosions. A huge quantity of evidence given to the Royal Commission has been sealed forever and can't be accessed by the public, including by the families. By early October last year, the mine had been completely sealed, with 200 cubic meters of gravel blocking the portal. In November and December, police announced that they had photographed human remains by drilling boreholes into the mine workings, but they couldn't answer basic questions, including why it had taken them 11 years to do this work, and why they had left it until after the mine was sealed, which prevents the remains from being recovered. News Hub reported that the police photographs showed deployed self-rescue breathing devices in the mine, which strongly suggests there may have been survivors following the first explosion. Police have refused to confirm this, but a thorough investigation of the mine workings would help to establish whether or not a rescue attempt could have been attempted in the first 5 days after the first explosion, before a second explosion then tore through the mine. Much more could be said about this ongoing investigation. Police have admitted to losing and destroying physical evidence over the years that blew out of the mine. They refused to comment on why tons of concrete was apparently poured down a ventilation shaft in the months following the disaster, potentially obliterating evidence underground in the mine at a time when Pike River Coal's manager was still in control of the site. One of the key lessons of Pike River is that police and the courts are not impartial. These are the forces of the capitalist state. They exist to maintain a class system in which the rich are protected. And Pike River is far from being an isolated example of this. In February 2011, just a few months after Pike River exploded, the CTV building collapsed in the Christchurch earthquake, killing 115 people. We have included an article about this in the book because of its many similarities to Pike River. The building, constructed in the 1980s, was in flagrant breach of regulations due to its cheap construction, which had been overlooked by the City Council's inspectors. In May 2017, police finally recommended that manslaughter charges be brought against the construction firm's owner, Alan Ray, and engineer David Harding. But the state solicitors rejected this and announced in November that year that no charges would be laid. Almost unbelievably, the families were told that prosecuting someone for actions that led to 115 deaths was not in the public interest, and that Ray was a man of good character. Man Al-Kaisi, whose wife died in the CTV building, said to me, quote, "I've been told many times he's influential," referring to Ray. So basically, if a person has money and contacts, he is above the law, end quote. In covering up these disasters, of course, Labour and National and their allies are also protecting themselves. It is these parties that are responsible for the totally deregulated environment that produced the Pike River disaster. This was a disaster 30 years in the making. The 1980s Labour government of David Lange and Finance Minister Roger Douglas launched a savage restructuring of the mining industry. The state coal mines was transformed into Coal Corp in 1987, and about half the mining workforce was made redundant, almost overnight, devastating towns all across the country. The same took place in forestry, railways, the postal service, electricity, telecommunications, which were all transformed into competitive businesses with tens of thousands of redundancies. Then in the 1990s, unemployment went above 10%, and none of this could have been done without the collaboration of the unions, which insisted that globalized production meant New Zealand businesses had to be internationally competitive and workers had to sacrifice for the good of the economy. Similar processes took place in Europe, America, and Australia, indeed everywhere in the world. Mass redundancies were followed by privatization and deregulation, including the dismantling of the Department of Labour's Specialist Mining Inspectorate by the National Party government in the 1990s. Jacinda Ardern's government, if anything, is more right-wing than the Lange-Douglas government. Its betrayal of the Pike River families is a microcosm of the role it has played in attacking the working class over the past, since it was elected. The government says that it can't afford a full investigation of the mine workings because of, quote, competing priorities, in Andrew Little's words. Over the last 2 years, though, Labour and its partners, New Zealand First and the Greens, used the pandemic to hand over tens of billions of dollars in public money to corporations. They poured billions more into the banks through quantitative easing, which has fueled the out-of-control housing bubble. The cost will be borne by workers, who already face soaring living costs. 1 in 4 children now lives in poverty, homelessness, and the reliance on charity is at record levels. Meanwhile, workers' health and their lives are being placed at tremendous risk. The abandonment of the zero COVID policy and the reopening of schools and non-essential businesses across the country, enforced by the trade unions, has led to Omicron spreading everywhere. These are just a few of the headlines from the past week. Public hospitals, which were already in a crisis before the pandemic, are now being overwhelmed with patients who they can't process. The more than 1,000 COVID deaths, more than 10 deaths per day, is just the tip of the iceberg. Tens of thousands of people are having medical procedures delayed for months on end. The question is, how many will die because they can't get timely treatment for cancer or heart disease or other conditions? There are estimates now that 200,000 people in New Zealand may develop long COVID, which can permanently damage the lungs, the heart, and the brain. Now the imperialist powers, as Max mentioned, are paving the way for an even more catastrophic loss of life. Jacinda Ardern has just visited the United States, where she appeared on The Late Show to declare the pandemic over and then met with President Biden to pledge New Zealand's ongoing support for the war against Russia in Ukraine and the build-up against China. In Ukraine, New Zealand is helping to arm an extreme right-wing forces, such as the Azov Battalion, who share the ideology of the Christchurch terrorist Brenton Tarrant. Now, nobody voted for these policies. Nobody voted for what could easily turn into a nuclear war, just as no one voted to get rid of COVID. To get rid of the COVID elimination policy and replace it with a policy of mass infection. Labour did not campaign on those issues. It lied, saying that it would address homelessness, that it would protect people's health, and that it would get truth and justice for the Pike River families. Now that the mine has been sealed, the government wants everyone to stop talking about Pike River. The recovery agency has been wound up, and the mine site is becoming part of a new walkway in the Paparoa National Park. But this crime and the decade-long cover-up will never be forgotten in the working class. We've received hundreds of comments supporting the families in the lead up to this meeting and outraged that there has been no justice and that the mine has been sealed. There's no shortage of anger, indeed fury, about what's happened, but what is needed is a coherent political perspective. The painful experience of the past decade contains vital lessons for working people. The connection must be made between the deaths at Pike River and all of the violence and exploitation which is produced by capitalism. One of the central lessons is that workers have to recognise that the Labour Party represents the rich, and it does so just as ruthlessly as National. Secondly, the unions are not workers' organisations. They are a privileged upper middle class bureaucracy whose role is to enforce attacks on the working class on behalf of big business and the state. To defend their basic interests and to organise a fight against austerity and the pandemic, workers have to establish new organisations. They have to establish their political independence from the Labour Party and the unions. And Terry, I believe, will speak more about what we advocate, which is for workers to form rank and file workplace committees that they themselves can control. Most importantly, the working class needs a socialist perspective and a socialist party. Everywhere in the world, workers are coming into struggle, from the United States to Sri Lanka, Europe and India, Australia and New Zealand, against the never-ending assault on living standards and on health and lives. These struggles require political organisation and leadership to unify workers across borders with the aim of abolishing capitalism, ending the anarchy of the market, and creating a planned socialist economy, not just in one country, but internationally. The world's wealth and resources must be controlled by those who work to produce it, instead of being hoarded by the world's billionaires. That is the only way to address the burning life and death issues of our time, to prevent World War III, and to end the pandemic, and to establish a high standard of living for all. We are fighting to build such a party, and we alone are fighting to build such a party in opposition to every other tendency in New Zealand and around the world, and in opposition to nationalism, racism, and the identity politics that is used to divide workers based on gender and ethnicity. As I said in our meeting 1 year ago on Pike River, I once again urge everyone here to seriously consider our program, read the World Socialist website, and join the Socialist Equality Group and our sister parties in the International Committee of the Fourth International. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Tom, for that important and comprehensive report. I think as you raise the obvious question, why has no one been held to account? And I think as you draw out in your report, very clearly there is a massive cover-up, above all, the role of the right-wing Jacinta Ardern government with the complicity and active cover-over by the unions. And I'm sure this has stimulated much thought, questions from the audience, and potential discussion. And we will, as I said before, at the concluding of the remarks and speeches, give opportunity for people to speak and to put questions in the chat. I can see so there's already some discussion developing, but Before that, I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker for today, who is Bernie Monk. He is well known in New Zealand as an advocate for many of the Pike River families. Last year, he played a major role in leading protests against the Labor government's decision to seal the mine, as well as taking legal action to try and stop them. Last June, a reporter asked Bernie whether he was tired after more than a decade of fighting against national and Labor governments, and he replied, quote, "I'll never be tired, because we owe it to the 29 men who went to work and never came home. Our death rates in the workplace are still as high as they were then," end quote. Bernie's speech to the Socialist Equality Group's webinar in May last year is also published in Pike River, The Crime and Cover-Up. So with that, a very warm welcome. Thank you, Bernie.
Good evening, guys, and thanks for this opportunity. It was well said, Tom, and you've done a lot of work for us, of which we're very humbled by. What I want to say is, why should a family group have to go through all these people? We've been through over 16 CEOs and chairmen of boards of Pike River, receivers, Solid Energy and Agency. We've been through over 16 police ministers, 16 police heads of Pike River. We're on our third Commissioner of Police. We've been through, we're on to our fourth Prime Minister, and under 10 years. And I'm gutted with the way they're trying to wear us out and hope us to go away. And this is the way they work. But anyway, what I want to say is where the cover-up started, and I didn't realise at the time, when we were having family meetings with the police, and I told them that I was going to get a lawyer to act on behalf of the families and wanted to make an announcement. And one of the police meetings, they refused me any authority to do that in the meeting. In fact, they barred me from the meeting and made me go and get a new venue to go and do. And I didn't realise how much this cover-up had started already. And this is only weeks after the explosion. Then we come to early in Easter of 2011, a lady from that was working for Doug White, who was his assistant secretary, came to me and showed me the self-rescue box open, and all the 30-odd sets of gear have gone missing. So I started to ask myself, what's going on here? And then the police tried to come down with the Conservation Department and close us down, of which we stopped them that particular day as well. So, and then somebody come to me and told me there were telephone calls made out after the mine, after the first explosion. We've never said that everyone survived the first explosion, but I'm saying now, and the evidence that we've gathered, I'm saying that some of these people did survive. And this was one of the reasons why we asked for them to put a borehole down by the fan, where we still say that is where the explosion happened. The police won't cooperate with us at all. In fact, we've even got letters that the police wrote to the ombudsman and told them not to give Dean Dunbar and Bernie Monk any more information on Pike River because it could interfere with their chance of a prosecution. We've been well aware of what we've been saying over this time, that we did not interfere with the art of the police getting a prosecution. But the questions we've been asking has been after all the events that went on after the first explosion. And it's endless, you know, and I must praise some people in this, with Dean Dunbar, who lost his 17-year-old son, Richard Healy, who's an electrical engineer, that have helped and done all this work extreme, that the hours that they've put into this is just, and have themselves been peer reviewed. So, and I know from a meeting with the police just recently, a lot of the stuff that was peer reviewed of Richard Healy's has actually been used for their evidence. What really frustrates me is that they won't cooperate with us at all, but they wanted us to come and join their investigation. However, we reneged on that because we wanted the police to go out and find all this evidence for themselves and not cover it up, because every time we bring something to them, they have something that, oh, no, that couldn't have happened. And this is what's happening at the moment of where they're saying the explosions happened. And we've got evidence to say to the contrary that they're completely wrong. We've found out that the police were given the wrong information to the commission, and we've pointed all this out to them. And only 3 weeks ago, I met one of the commissioners. He come and see me at Paroa, and he told me, he said, Bernie, he said, I cannot understand why charges haven't been laid, because we were told after, before the commission ended, that the Department of Labour were definitely going to be laying charges, and definitely so were the police. And here he said, I can't understand why no charges ever been made. It's all about money. And that's what all I can take from this. They're not prepared to do the work. Even the last, sealing up, we went back to them with a plan, a $7 million plan, and they were trying to print out that it was going to cost them another $50 to $80 million, which is a lot of rot. So does this mean that our team are going to go and work for the defence, or are they just going to pull out all stops like they did in other disasters, such as the Erebus disaster, such as Cave Creek disaster? And you watch what's going to happen with White Island. I can see this Pike all over again, and it brings tears to my eyes that people are going to have to put up with the rot and the covering up that these people have done. I can go on all night about what this has meant to the families. We have been shoved aside. The media have been told to go away. Who the heck is paying the media, which are basically pretty broke there? The only thing that's kept them alive is all the advertising and everything else that the government are paying for to put in their papers and on their televisions and everything else. And one of their things is, I put my bottom line on it, don't cover Pike River. The biggest thing I can tell you, and I'll end this because I can go on for a long time, and I think there's some questions to be wanted to be asked, but you know how there's a black box in an aeroplane? Well, there's a black box in a coal mine. And our group have got the black box. And I promise you now, we will bring this information out, whether the police are going to bring charges or not. We will name names and we'll show how this cover-up has actually been done. We've sat aside and not really gone public on this, but they now know that we have that black box, and I bet they're squirming. And I will just end on that. And if there's any questions want to be asked, I'm only too happy to answer any.
Thanks very much, Bernie. I think, as you say, this is all about the money, and it really is from the tireless efforts of yourself and other family members, who lost their children in this disaster. That all of this evidence came to light. The tireless fight that you and others. I'm not sure what happened to my video there. I apologise about that. But yes, and we will have time for questions, among other things. If there are any immediate questions, please, for Bernie, who I think may have to leave, early. I would encourage you to put it in the chat now, so that we can ask them before we get through the other speakers. So if there are any questions at all.
Well, I guess just to clarify, one point Bernie referred to was the White Island disaster, which happened in December 2019, when a group of tourists were caught in a volcanic eruption in basically an island off the coast of the North Island, and 22 of them died, and many others were hideously injured. And I believe about a dozen different organizations have been charged with health and safety breaches. So far, nobody has been convicted, but I entirely concur with what Bernie said about that, and that the wealthy tourism organizations who have profited enormously from taking people to visit this active volcano, an extremely dangerous practice, you can bet your bottom dollar that they will get off scot-free. There is, I think, a question that's just appeared in the chat that I'll read out for Bernie. It says, before I do that, I'm not sure if we actually mentioned that Bernie is the father of Michael Monk, who died at Pike River, a pretty important point. Michael died at the age of 23, and Bernie has since then been a leading spokesman for the families. So I just thought I would say that in case we left it out. But the question that has appeared is, for Bernie, I'm intrigued, is it public knowledge that you have the black box, Bernie? Has that been made public, that you have that data?
No, it hasn't. No, it hasn't.
Well, I hope you realize that it has now.
Yeah, well, I'm not really worried about that, but that is half the reason why we haven't gone out and bought a lot of the... You've got to realise that we're dealing with the same police people that did the first investigation, that let the people off, and we've got the same people doing the investigation for the second time. Do you think that's fair? I don't.
That's right. And the follow-up question, do you wish to release any information here about what that black box contains? I'm not sure if you do, but
no. Look, maybe Tom, you and I can get together and do another session and put on your website on things along with Richard and Dean, and maybe we could take this a step further. But I reassure you that a lot of things went on after the first explosion. Like, everyone said that there was a massive rockfall, and the government lived on that, but there was never a rockfall. It was only a coalfall, and that happened after the first explosion, and that is the reason why the men couldn't get out of the mine. But there was a fresh air line going through that coalfall, sorry, and after the people that we know started the belt up that caused the second explosion, the police turned that oxygen off, and those that did survive that explosion died. And that's about as far as I'll go to at the moment.
Well, thank you very much, Bernie, for being here. I mean, there is another follow-up question. I mean, have the police been protecting the power base, the companies and the government? I mean, our perspective, as we laid out in just now, is yes. I mean, that is the role they have played, objectively speaking.
Not only that, Tom, is I want to sort of say things. They've been boasting about finding bodies. We showed them those bodies in 2011. They might have got better pictures of the bodies, but we showed them those bodies in 2011. And I remember meeting the Prime Minister, Labor Prime Minister now, and Little in a meeting just straight after they said that they would. And I'm telling you now that Andrew Little promised me in Parliament buildings that they were going to go and get the men out of the mine. He can say all he likes, but he said to me that they were going to get the men out of the mine. And irrespective of what he wants to say publicly now, that was said to me. And so did John Key. And we've got a recording on John Key actually saying that. So I don't know why it's all money. It's all money, and it's a wee bit unfortunate, but we don't deserve that. Our families don't deserve what they've done to us.
No, exactly. Exactly. It is all money. Well, you said it. I mean, and we, again, really thank you for being here, and we definitely will catch up again, and we will continue to write about this. I mean, this is not over, you know.
No.
Not by a long shot. And I think the point you've just raised is so much information has been leaked to you guys, to the families, which the police and the government agencies would rather not have been made public, including the fact, as you said, that it was well known that there were bodies within the mine workings very early on, which was kept from the public, basically.
Well, we were always said that everyone was incinerated. Everything was ashes, and so when all this information came to us, we went out and investigated the whole thing ourselves. And I think that is what's really annoyed all these government departments, police, etc., saying that the families have got to keep their mouths shut because they could ruin their chance of a prosecution. Hey, listen, we've never ever said anything to the contrary. The phone calls were made, after the mine. And why did the police actually wipe the phone call it was made on a recorder to the lady who and that was wiped by the police as evidence. Why did the police lose a box, or the Department of Labour and Police lose an electrical box which could have told them there and then about the cause of the explosion? I mean, this is just, it's endless what I can tell you, but I just haven't got the time on this call to explain it all to you. But I'm telling you, New Zealand, and I'm telling you overseas, this is a huge cover-up. Don't worry about that. And we will honestly bring it to the people when we see fit. Don't worry about that. We're going to do that. And I promise, and I've promised the families this, and I'm going to do it along with my good friend Dean Dunbar and Richard Healy, the men that have really, and all the other people like the Tony Forsters and all those people that have done extreme amount of work to actually make this happen. And they know the truth. I don't need to lie. And I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bernie. And we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, thanks very much. I will sign off. And if anyone wants any questions, just put them through Tom, and we'll get back to them on anything they want to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you.
Cheers.
And thank you on behalf of everybody here. Thank you for those important points and contributions. Well, we will have more time for questions and discussion. We do have two more speakers, which I will introduce. But the next speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce our next guest, who is Malcolm Bray. He joins us from Barnsley in South Yorkshire, once a centre of the coal mining industry in Britain. He is a former coal miner from Woolly Colliery, where he was an active participant in the 1984-85 British miners' strike. He is the founder of the Miners' Strike 1984-5 Facebook group, and his support for the Pike River miners and their families is recorded in the appendix to the book. So he is a long-time supporter of the Socialist Equality Party, and with that, very much like to welcome Malcolm.
Good morning. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this meeting. And I'd like to express greetings to this online meeting and to the families of the Pike River miners who have fought for justice. I want to congratulate Tom Peters and Mehring Books for publishing this account. The Pike River mine disaster was a crime and it was a cover-up. The company and the Ardern Labour government sealed the mine because they wanted to bury the truth. But the truth is not so easily buried. This book is the record of a determined struggle by the families to uncover the real reasons for the deaths of 29 miners. What this book also shows is that Pike River miners and their families found support not from the Labour Party or the trade unions or the media with their vast resources, but from the socialist movement, which possesses something far more important: political principles. The company, the union, and successive governments worked to cover up their criminal actions in sacrificing miners' safety and lives to shareholder profit. In the days after the mine explosion, Labour politicians, such as Damien O'Connor, tried to conceal the company's shocking record on mine safety, but the WSWS exposed these efforts. It warned there would be no justice from the Royal Commission that was announced by Prime Minister John Key in November 2010. Its sole purpose was to shield those responsible. At the start of the inquiry, Judge Graham Parkhurst declared, "No one is on trial, there are no sides, no one will win or lose." Many miners who wanted to believe otherwise. I know there were also hopes that a Labour government would bring long-awaited justice. The Royal Commission was a whitewash, despite finding that Pike River Coal Limited breached numerous safety laws and turned the mine into a death trap to cut costs. No one was prosecuted and not a single body was recovered. Ardern ordered the mine sealing over the pleas of family members who were denied even the right to bury their loved ones. This is how the ruling class treat workers everywhere. In Britain, in 2017, a fire at Grenfell Tower in London claimed 72 lives. Mountains of evidence show the fire was caused by cost-cutting, including a decision to wrap the tower in cheap, flammable cladding, but not a single charge has been laid against the guilty. The public inquiry, established by the Tories with the support of Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, has now entered its 5th year. It has no power to prosecute and excludes any investigation of the broader economic, political, or social causes. The WSWS described Grenfell as an act of social murder, a term borrowed from Friedrich Engels, the lifelong collaborator of Karl Marx. In his Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845, Engels wrote the following: "When society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet too early and unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or the bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequences, knows that these thousands of victims must perish and yet permits these conditions to remain. Its deed is murder, just as surely as the deed of the single individual." Grenfell was a warning of greater crimes to come. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the British government has pursued a policy of herd immunity. The deliberate mass infection of millions resulted in more than 200,000 dead. Johnson's declaration, "No more effing lockdowns, let the bodies pile high." It's only the most infamous example of a policy pursued worldwide. For months, we have been told the pandemic is over. Despite around 1,000 people still dying each week, the ruling class knows they are paving the way for the next deadly mutation and the next wave of mass deaths. I'm a former miner and I want to say something about the experience of British miners. In 1984-85 miners' strike was a historic, heroic struggle involving nearly 200,000 miners against incredible odds. An entire year we fought the Thatcher government and the state. We fought pitched battles with police herding scabs into pits, Thousands were arrested and jailed. Some were killed. David Gareth Jones and Joe Green. I attended both funerals. They tried to starve us back to work, but failed due to the massive support from workers. In Britain, Women Against Prick closures who kept us fed, and from workers all over the world, including donation and aids from workers in Australia and New Zealand. The struggle for the UK miners is still ongoing today as the battle the Tory government over miners' pension scheme. They have stolen billions of pounds from the scheme based on a flimsy promise of protecting the MPS miners' pension scheme and share a part of a surplus profit generated from investments without investing any money at all. This is further proof of the criminality of governments towards the working class. The main lesson is that in the end, we were defeated, not by the state, but by the trade unions and the Labour Party. Just think of this, 1 year on strike with no solidarity action organised by the TUC, faced with a Labour leader, Neil Kinnock, who described the police as the meat in the sandwich between miners and scabs, even as they were kicking our heads in, beating us with truncheons and mounting horse charge against us. The great crime of the leader of the NUM, Arthur Scargill, was that he never challenged this betrayal and insisted we could win simply by militant struggle, a deliberate political evasion. Such defeats exact a terrible price. Since 1985, the trade unions have lurched so far to the right that you can even call them unions. They are corporatist syndicates that act as an extension of management. The Labour Party is indistinguishable from Johnson's Tory Party. We've gone through 4 decades where the class struggle has been suppressed by these organisations and their counterparts internationally. The number of strikes flatlined, wages were slashed, social services destroyed, and health and safety torn up such a degree that many workplaces are death traps. The suppression of the class struggle has come to an end. The experience of the pandemic has confirmed to millions of workers that capitalism is a rotten system led by political and social criminals. Now we are facing a brutal assault on wages and living standards, the likes of which no one of us have ever seen, and the launching of a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine that threatens nuclear Armageddon. What was demonstrated at Pike River, the subordination of lives to corporate profit and the bankruptcy of the trade unions and the Labour Party, is now being played out before billions of workers the world over. It's time to build a new leadership and adopt a new political perspective of socialist internationalism to replace the profit system with planned production for human need. It's in that spirit that I recommend all miners and workers everywhere to read Tom's devastating account of Pike River as part of their political education for the immense class battles ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I think as you demonstrated in your report, the experience in Pike River and for the families in Pike River are in that sense international. And, you know, bringing in the brutality in Grenfell Tower, precursor to the question of the pandemic, but then also the, you know, the lessons of the British miners' strike in 84-85, which was really a lesson, a watershed moment for workers in the UK, but internationally. And that the main lesson was the defeat was carried out by the trade unions and the Labour Party. And I'm sure there'll be discussion, maybe questions that'll come up following our final speaker today, who I'll introduce now. So our final speaker is Terry Cook. Terry is a founding member of the SEP in Australia and long-standing writer for the World Socialist website. He writes frequently on industrial struggles and the conditions of the working class. Terry's speech delivered to the last public meeting on the lessons of the 1994 Mora disaster in Australia is contained in the final chapters of the book. So I'd like to very much welcome Terry.
Thank you, comrades and friends. I also would like to applaud the SEP group for publishing this book. It certainly establishes the historic record and draws the necessary strategic lessons to educate workers in New Zealand internationally, now and into the future. When I addressed the SEP group's meeting on this disaster on May 8, 2021, I referred to the string of similar mining disasters that had occurred over the years in Australia, resulting in deaths and horrendous injuries. As Max said, these events are of international significance. I drew attention to the real purpose of the official government inquiries launched in the wake of these disasters, which was to carry out a whitewash to placate popular anger and dissipate it into a dead end of official channels. Even when these inquiries were unable to achieve a complete cover-up and were forced to acknowledge the employer was to blame, governments quickly intervened to ensure no legal action was taken against these companies. I began with the fraudulent mine wardens inquiry called by the Queensland State Labor Government into the explosion at the BHP No. 2 mine on August 7, 1994 in Mara in central Queensland. This claimed the lives of 11 workers whose bodies remain entombed in the mine that was sealed by the company in the wake of the second explosion. Now, even though this inquiry was forced to find that BHP was indeed responsible for having sent these men underground while knowing a highly dangerous situation existed, it still recommended that no charges be brought against this company. I started with this inquiry for the very reason because it became the template to be used by governments in future disasters, and possibly would have been taken on board by the New Zealand authorities also. Our investigations into Mara and other deadly mining incidents also established the pivotal role of the mining unions, not only in the cover-ups, but also in creating the highly unsafe conditions across the mining industry and every other sector of the economy. Under the banner of making Australian-based companies internationally competitive, the unions have overseen the massive casualisation across mining, have helped impose around-the-clock working, and have worked to dismantle even those nominally independent workers or job organisations that had to some degree overseen safety. The union's role in subordinating workers' health and safety to the drive for profits has been on full display throughout the COVID pandemic in this country, including their joining hands with employers to demand exemptions for whole sections of industry from lockdown and other preventative health measures, resulting in mass infections of workers. At the last meeting, I also reported on the Board of Inquiry into the May 6, 2020 explosion at the Anglo-Americans mine, underground Grosvenor mine in central Queensland. This left 5 workers with horrific injuries, and it was ongoing at the time of the last meeting. Now, to give some idea of the extent of these injuries, let me refer to those sustained by miner Wayne Sellers, who courageously appeared in person on April 7 last year to testify to the inquiry on the highly unsafe conditions in the mine in the lead up to the explosion. Sellers suffered burns to 70% of his body, as well as kidney failure, for which he had to receive dialysis. He spent 3 weeks in intensive care unit and then a further 6 weeks in a burns unit. After being discharged, he was readmitted due to the development of blood clots on his lungs. At the time of his appearance, he had undergone 10 surgeries with 3 more rounds of laser surgery shed that year, as well as hand and ear reconstructions. Similar injuries were sustained by the other miners. The inquiry into Grosvenor was initiated by the Queensland Labor government for the very same reasons as the 1994 Mehring inquiry, to contain popular anger that had already been generated by a whole spate of fatalities across the state's mines, and to gain time to organise a cover-up designed to get the government and the company off the hook. Again, our party closely followed and extensively reported on this inquiry, warning the working class that, like those of the past, it was a damage control exercise. Even before the inquiry got underway, there were two significant developments that demonstrated its fraudulent character and to which we drew attention. First, Anglo-American managers refused to testify to the inquiry on the grounds of self-incrimination, a move that was fully supported by the state Labor government. Then, Australian National University health and safety expert, Professor Andrew Hopkins, was forced to recuse himself from the inquiry following a complaint by Anglo-American over an interview he gave after the Grosvenor mine explosion, but before his appointment to the inquiry. What prompted Anglo's complaint and caused outrage was that in this interview, Hopkins made a telling observation that there existed striking similarities in the conditions leading up to the Grosvenor explosion with those before the 1994 Mara disaster. He stated, and I quote, "It seems there were consistently high levels of methane gas being recorded at the time in the mine, explosive levels of methane gas, and this was apparently one of the main causes of this accident. This was known beforehand, there were concerns raised beforehand, and nothing effective was done. In that respect, this was very much like the Mara accident." Clearly, no reference to Mara was to be allowed. Why? Because any investigation of this experience would have cut across the cover-up operation being conducted in relationship to Grosvenor. The CFMEU, for its part, doubled down on its support for the fraudulent Board of Inquiry that it had originally hailed as an opportunity for a thoroughgoing, wide-ranging and independent examination of the shocking events. So, what was the outcome of this acclaimed so-called independent examination? In February this year, some 8 months after the Board of Inquiry brought down its findings, the Queensland Labor government's workplace health and safety prosecutor announced it would not bring charges against Anglo-American or any of its managerial staff. Prosecutor Aaron Gilfile incredulously declared, having assessed the brief of evidence against the guidelines of the Director of Public Prosecutions, I am not satisfied there exists a reasonable prospect of securing a conviction against any of the identified duty holders. Now, this brief of evidence, dismissed by Gilfile, included a list of conscious actions taken by the company that created the conditions that inevitably led to the disaster, and, as was stated in the inquiry's findings, exposed the workers to an acceptable risk. This included enforcing a rate of production that continually produced methane gas levels exceeding the capacity of the mine's gas drainage system, and then going on to implement a coal cutting method that ramped up production even further. It also abandoned a series of essential safeguards designed to manage gas levels before commencing work on the power panel that exploded. And it did not carry out the required specific spontaneous combustion risk assessments prior to starting production on the panel or at any other time. Demonstrating the prosecutor's decision was fully determined by the state Labor government, that is by political necessity, Queensland Resources Minister Scott Stewart cynically declared he understood workers' anger and dismay over this decision, but then he added, however, I respect the independence of the work, health and safety prosecutor. In a face-saving operation following the prosecutor's decision, mining union Queensland President Stephen Smythe told the media that he was personally devastated by this decision, but then added it was a foreseeable event and no action was taken to protect the miners at Grosvenor. However, this is a finger pointing in both ways. The union itself was also well aware of the dangerous condition existing in the mine. It had been informed by numbers of miners, but it did not take any action to protect the workers either, or to prevent them being sent underground on the day of the disaster. This was because the CMFU's main concern, as always, was to maintain its position as a virtual arm of the company, of labour broking agency, and an industrial policeman. It's from this the union officialdom derives its lucrative privileges, sometimes six-figure salaries of the top officials. To fight to end this industrial carnage, workers must now draw the lessons of these bitter experiences, and it's in that way I think this book will contribute to that. They cannot, under any circumstances, leave matters in the hands of the unions, or indeed place any faith in the Labour Party or any of the other capitalist parties, all of which are instruments of big business, and they've proven themselves to be so. New independent organisations and struggles, including rank and file committees, must now be formed, both in Australia, in New Zealand, and internationally, to enforce basic safety conditions in the workplaces and to defend workers' interests at every level. This must be linked to a fight for a workers' government. This is necessary to implement socialist policies, including placing the mines, along with the banks and major corporations, under the public ownership and democratic control of the working class. It is the working class that is the necessary force in society. It is the working class that produce all wealth and all value. They should control society, not the billionaires, not the capitalists, and not the financial and corporate elite. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Terry. Again, I think your report just makes clear the international character of the Pike River mine disaster. I mean, the same processes were underway with Grosvenor in Australia, but again, it's the role that is played by the Labor government and the unions in covering over the disaster and making sure no one is held accountable, because in particular the CFMEU want to remain as an arm of the company. I think the call and the absolute necessity for the formation of new organisations and rank and file committees comes out of that. And I think all of the reports have been really informative and very detailed. So I'm sure that there are many questions that have emerged, and there's already some. I will read. There's been much discussion in the chat, which I think is important. We do encourage as much as possible, as well as if anyone would like to speak, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat to do so. Sometimes it's a raise the hand button in down below on Zoom, or it can be under what's called reactions. Anyway, it does depend on how you've logged in through Zoom. But if you can't find the raise the hand button and you would like to speak, please just indicate in the chat. But I think there's been much support for the speakers. I mean, Sage raised, in regards to when Bernie Monk was going through and detailing the fight by the families, that it is really shocking. Thanked him for his work, the energy, and I hope this does finally have a just outcome. My heart bleeds for you in all of this. A person named Green very much said they're pleased to hear from a former miner. I would class him as an expert, while also Sage saying, well said, Malcolm. Grenfell Tower was a crying shame, a stain on the British government. We need to unite against the crimes against the working poor. There was a there was a question, or at least a statement that I think Tom wanted to make some points on. It was from Sage right at the beginning, who said could do without the Russian propaganda re Ukraine as fascism, entrenched in all parts of Europe, and Russia is capitalist. Perhaps, Tom, did you want to begin to make some points on that?
Yes, well, I can, and perhaps there may be others who would like to as well. But I guess, we completely reject the claim that we're somehow Russian propagandists. I mean, which is being used against anyone who opposes the escalation of this war in Ukraine. We're truly surrounded by pro-war propaganda. And really, I think there's nowhere outside of the World Socialist website that genuinely opposes it. It's not Russian propaganda to say that the Ukrainian armed forces include fascists in very prominent roles. We're not talking about a small group here. This is a militia, the Azov battalion, that is well integrated into the Ukrainian war effort, has thousands of members, and is receiving high-powered weapons now from NATO and the United States. And New Zealand is now involved in coordinating the delivery of supplies into Ukraine. And it is a fact that Brenton Tarrant, the fascist terrorist in New Zealand, visited the Ukraine and liked it so much that he thought about moving there to live there. And when he carried out his attack, he used a symbol that is commonly used by the Azov battalion, on a Nazi symbol or a fascist symbol on his backpack, I believe. I would urge people to read our coverage of this war, because there is a huge amount of propaganda in the media. I can't go through everything and debunk everything at this meeting, but firstly, we oppose Russia's invasion. I mean, it's completely reactionary. It's nationalist. It's leading to, obviously, thousands of deaths. And it also, it serves to sow hatred and divisions between people, throughout Eastern Europe and Russia. And it plays into the hands of the United States and the NATO imperialist powers, which have been, wanted this to happen. I mean, this conflict did not begin with the Russian invasion this year. Its roots go well back, really, to the dissolution of the Soviet Union by the Stalinist bureaucracy, which then was seized upon by the US and by the European powers to expand NATO up to Russia's border and to prepare for war against Russia. Ukraine has played a key role in those preparations. A major turning point that we've covered extensively on the World Socialist website was the coup d'etat in 2014, where US and Germany in particular sponsored far-right forces to overthrow the government and install an anti-Russian government that has promoted, very heavily promoted, individuals such as Stepan Bandera, the leader of the Ukrainian fascists during World War II, a Nazi collaborator responsible for organizing the murder of, tens or hundreds of thousands of Jews and others in Ukraine during World War II. I mean, he's now celebrated as a national hero by this government in Ukraine. So, billions of dollars have been spent to arm Ukraine to prepare for this war against Russia. The aim has nothing to do with protecting a supposed democracy in Ukraine. The aim is to weaken Russia and to prepare for a much more bloody war, which will also extend well beyond Russia. I mean, there are now major preparations very far advanced for war against China. And the United States has made it very clear that is their priority, to basically to dominate the world's markets and resources, and that Russia and China are the major obstacles to that. Anyway, I think hopefully perhaps someone can post some links to our articles in the chat, because this is a major issue. And as I said, there's a huge amount of disinformation about it in the media, including in New Zealand. And there is, it's not a simple question what to basically establish what is an anti-war, a genuinely anti-war position on this conflict. It's not to support either side. It's certainly not to support what the US and all of its allies are doing in arming the Ukraine and extending this conflict. Anyway, I will leave it there. But as I said, others may want to expand.
Thanks, Tom, and there will be time for more questions and discussion on this question. There were two questions that that have come through, or one that I didn't read out before, but did come through during Bernie Monk's report from Mike. It says, to what extent does the disinformation, to what extent does the defamation laws in New Zealand impact on bringing out the truth? And then there's a question just come through from Norman saying, wasn't Andrew Little, who was the union rep for the West Coast Miners Union, who was acting as the health and safety officer who signed off the mine as meeting all the safety requirements 3 months before the explosion? So to answer that question, I'll call on John Braddock, who is a member of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand. He writes extensively for the World Socialist website, including on the question of Pike River. He's penned a number of important articles and spoken at our meeting. So I'll hand over to John, who should be able to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me, Max?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yes, no, actually, I was wanting to contribute on the previous question about the war, which I think is very significant. I mean, there's a fundamental connection between the subject of today's meeting on the suppression of the working class with the drive to war internationally. I mean, it's a well-known connection between the struggle against workers at home and the expansion of imperialist war overseas. And what we have at the moment is the US leading an operation of all the major powers, including Britain and, of course, New Zealand and Australia, in a proxy war involving Ukraine and the Ukrainian working class, who are very much victims of this drive, while at the same time imposing austerity measures against the working class at home in every country. I mean, the US is facing an enormous crisis of living standards. Workers throughout the country are taking action against the Biden administration. Britain is in the middle of a cost of living crisis with inflation over 9%. And New Zealand's participation in the war is also bound up with a similar cost of living crisis at home. Now, you know, the Ardern government came into office in 2017, making all sorts of promises to do away with child poverty, the housing crisis, and so on, none of which have been addressed. They have now used the coronavirus, as Tom said, to transfer billions of dollars into the hands of the rich, while now, in the last 6 months, giving way to the propaganda of the business community to close down their elimination strategy. So all of these measures that are being implemented at home are bound up absolutely with the requirement to impose their agenda overseas as well. So there's an absolute connection between all of these questions. It's not a matter of putting forward Russian propaganda. It's a matter of putting forward a program to defend the interests of the working class in every country against international finance capital. So that was the other main points I wanted to make in relation to this question. But the two questions that were asked specific to Pike River, Tom may be in a better position to answer those.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, well, I will answer this question from Norman. I think that is it the case that Andrew Little personally signed off on the mine as meeting safety requirements 3 months before the explosion? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure if there is any document showing that or not. But if it exists, I haven't seen it. I mean, there are serious questions about what the union knew and when did it know. I mean, we, as I raised, there was a walkout at Pike River before the explosion, sometime before the explosion, and those workers informed the union of their concerns. So the union was well aware that their workers were concerned about safety in the mine. And they didn't say anything about that publicly. They didn't take any organized industrial action. And after the explosion, as I quoted, Andrew Little defended the company until it became obvious that he could no longer do that because the evidence was coming out about what a dangerous operation it was. But we raise in the book that any genuine investigation into this disaster has to include what was the role of the union, and the union has really not released or released virtually nothing of its correspondence with Pike River, its dealings with the company, and what it actually knew and when it knew it. I mean, there was evidence given by the union to the Royal Commission, but it is limited, and of course we don't know everything that was given to the Royal Commission because that evidence has largely been sealed and hidden from the public. So I'll just make those points about that question. I'm not sure what the other question was, Max.
It was on defamation. To what extent does the defamation laws in New Zealand impact on bringing out the truth? That's the other question, Tom.
Well, again, I have to say I don't know. I'm not an expert on the defamation law in New Zealand. I think it certainly is something we have to be cautious about. But I couldn't really comment on that.
Well, there are some other comments and questions coming through that I'll read out. I mean, there's some comments in regards agreeing again, on Andrew Little. I really wonder how Andrew Little had so much power to make his final decision. What would Andrew Little know about mining anyway? Priscilla says ACC, the unions, WorkSafe, and government agencies have conflict of interest in bigger companies. Some also pay to political parties. And then there's a question from Sage. Do you think health and safety should have more teeth? Is it a matter of changing laws or ensuring the law is enforced? The police continually fail to take up cases. CTV building, fake engineer, and Pike is the question.
Yeah, well, just to begin with, I mean, I think it's a very important question. It sort of goes to the heart of the issue. What is actually the solution to protect workers? Is it a matter of changing the law? And as you probably know, if you followed Pike River, that's what was promised out of the Royal Commission by both parties, that, this was a terrible tragedy, but we're going to rewrite the laws and it will never happen again. Well, I mean, that was a lie. As well as the CTV building, there was also the White Island eruption, which we've already talked about. The deaths continue. I mean, in the forestry industry, there's a regular reports of deaths. There were 2 deaths which we reported on in the space of a week at 2 separate ports in Lyttelton and Auckland. So the issue is not the laws. I mean, the issue is the enormous power of big business, which is protected by all the parties sitting in Parliament and the whole capitalist system, and also the unions themselves. That's the key issue. And so what we've raised, and it relates to the pandemic as well, is that workers have to organize themselves. They have to take matters into their own hands, not believe and trust in the Labour Party to change the law. That's been proven not to do anything. It will just, the deaths will just continue. And those responsible for the worst atrocities, such as Pike River, are never going to be held to account. So to defend themselves, workers have got to organise and to do so with new forms of organisation that are genuinely democratic, that are genuinely based on the rank and file. That's what has to happen. I'll just leave it there.
I'll call on some other speakers to make some points too, but just, I really want to encourage everybody here. I think the reports, speeches and discussion make clear how essential this book is for every worker and everybody to have a copy of. You can see on your screen how to order a copy. For New Zealand residents, you contact the Socialist Equality Group at Socialist Equality NZ at gmail.com. You will see our tech team will put in the chat the link for that email, or you can message the SEG on their Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Socialist Equality NZ. If you're in Australia to make the purchase, you can do so through the mehringbooks.com.au site. Again, you can see the link on the screen, but it will be put in the chat as well in order for you to be able to purchase this, I think, really essential book. I really do encourage everybody here today to get a copy for your friends and family. I mean, the essential questions, political questions that get raised in this book are, as I think has been detailed, not only of vital importance for those in New Zealand, but really internationally. To also answer some of the questions that have come up, I will now hand over to Comrade Cheryl, who is the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia. So, Comrade Cheryl.
Thanks, Max. Look, I just wanted to comment on some of the comments that have been posted on the chat, which I think actually are really very important and go to the heart of what we're addressing in terms of certainly Pike River, but what the connection is between the experience, I mean, the tragedy, which is Pike River. But as I think Malcolm outlined, Terry, Tom, Pike River is an expression. It is a sharp indication and experience, which in fact is one which is being had by millions of workers throughout the world, whether they're in mining, whether they're in the metal industry, whether they're in a hospital or a school. These are now, I mean, no one is suggesting that in a hospital or in a school, one would be in danger of an explosion and a rockfall. But what nurses, doctors, teachers, and students confront in a school and in a hospital now is the prospect of infection, certainly through COVID, but now increasingly, possibly other variants of other airborne and infectious diseases, of disease, of illness, and possible death. Now, these aren't the result of accident, of oversight, of mistakes, but these are the conscious policy of capitalist governments, whether they are in the form of the Ardern Labor government, whether they are going to be in the form of the Albanese Labor government in Australia, which was elected now 2 weeks ago, or the Tories in the Johnson government in Britain or in the United States. What is, and one of the points that I think our speakers have tried to draw out is the unanimity in that sense of the experiences that ordinary workers and people are going through. I mean, a nurse is now, whether they're in Wellington, Auckland, or anywhere else, are working under a crushing, I mean, mind-numbing level of work and danger, which is unprecedented. Teachers now are working under conditions where it is impossible to actually complete what they have been trained for. In fact, such is the level of infection, of illness, of burnout, of workload that now exists in schools, and lack of staff, that in fact children are going to school, certainly in New South Wales, certainly in Victoria, and there's not teachers to teach them. There's not even adults to supervise them. And yet governments insist that the education system is robust. They insist that the hospitals are okay, despite the fact that the death tolls, the infection rates rise exponentially. Now, why is this happening? I mean, what you have a situation internationally, and certainly I'm not suggesting that it's equal in every country, but in the space of 2 years in the United States, life expectancy has dropped by 2 years. Now, that is the first time since the end of World War II that has taken place. What has been a characteristic of the post-war period, which has been a rise in life expectancy, it has been, and that has itself arisen from mass vaccinations, from increased knowledge of medical, health, sanitary requirements, which itself has been the result of the demands and the struggles of the working class. Anybody who thinks that these elements of life have been created out of the goodness of the hearts of the capitalist class, that would be a mistake. What is now taking place is that the issue of life, the issue of the protection of life and well-being has been dispensed with in favour of profit and production. And so the relationship, I think, as John went through between war, between the pandemic and Pike River, is an absolute intrinsic one. And in any form, any workplace, whether you work for Amazon, whether you work for Coles and warehouse storage facilities, retail, it is the unrelenting demand for increased productivity, whether that impacts on the health and well-being of workers or not. And what we're seeing in that sense is the real face of capitalism, the real relationships of capitalism. And that's not a mistake. The decision to allow the pandemic to run rife is not a mistake. It is a policy, and it's a policy which exists on all aspects and elements of human life. And the only force, I mean, it's not as if, you know, doctors, scientists don't understand. I know here there is a furious discussion taking place between health officials of the government in the form of Nick Coatsworth, Greg Dorr, some of these spokesmen for government policy, which they now are unrepentant. As Coatsworth says, look, all right, you know, there is an increase in death. Yes, that is true, but they're all old. You know, it's ridiculous to talk about a plane load of people a week in Australia dying from COVID, which is what is happening. As he said, on a plane, you have babies, you have other you have other aged people, up until old people. He says the majority of people who are dying now are at the end of their life. You know, they were elderly, probably wouldn't have survived anyway. What's the issue? But of course, I mean, one, that is a statement, not just of Coatsworth, but really of the government as a whole, irrespective of what they say. But in fact, you know, this policy is impacting and will impact the whole of society, including children, including babies, who now have a future of either being, you know, confined to their homes so that they can't communicate and socialise, or face the prospect of infection, long COVID, the possible implications on their entire lives of health. And that's what confronts the working class as a whole. But their attitude to the elderly is not just an attitude to the elderly, it is an attitude to the working class. And that's why the dispensing of concern of life in regards to the pandemic, or in regards to a mining accident, or the collapse of a building, or war, is the same. And so the question is the system itself. This arises out of the capitalist system as a whole. The only force that can prevent war, that can stop the degradation of the planet, that can prevent the threat of human life not being able to live in this planet, of being able to have a future for young people, is in fact the working class and the overthrow of capitalism. It's not that the laws don't have enough teeth. The laws have all the teeth that capitalism allows. The point is that those forces that implement these policies are now represented in the unions, in the Labor Party. There has been, in the last 30 years, a transformation of these organisations. Workers have to understand they cannot look towards these outfits, these organisations, to protect them, to represent their interests. It's ordinary people that have got to now take up these tasks and these responsibilities. They have to do it through the development of their own independent organisations, democratic, that allow discussion, that allow questions, allow differences, and that are answered in the interests of the working class. And those organisations have to be animated by a fight for a socialist perspective. So the issues that I think have been raised in regards to Pike River have immense implications for every section of the working class in every country. And that's why we hold these meetings, to fight to clarify, to answer questions, and to provide an alternative perspective.
I thank you, Cheryl. There was numbers of comments as you were speaking, certainly support for what's being said. And I think it relates to some of the other questions that have come up in the course of that. And I did want to call on Terry, who wanted to make some points. I just will read out how it emerged in the chat, because I think in itself it's instructive. I mean, Priscilla said, you know, she was a union rep and health safety, a union and health safety rep. No support, and there are times when we are silenced by the company and union reps. She then went on to expand and said, I was forced to step down for raising concerns for asbestos removal on behalf of the workers in my plant. The union and health and safety rep called my plant manager on his cell phone and handed it to me and told me, quote, you have done enough, you can stand down. And then following that, there was a question from Sage, you know, saying, do we need unions to be different, tougher? And if so, how? Wouldn't the government just crush that? So I'll hand over to Terry to make some points on those questions.
Thank you for the question. I think it's an important question, and it has to be dealt with, you know, historically. The thing is, the working class, in its struggle to improve its conditions, have necessarily come into conflict with the whole entire structure of capitalism. The truth is, the operations of the capitalist system are completely opposed, and always has been, to the fundamental requirements of the working class. Unions, when they came into operation, were formed not on the basis of the overthrow of capitalism. That's never been their program, but to win reforms under capitalism in order to contain the class struggle within inside the frameworks of the profit system, therefore never challenge capitalism fundamentally. Now, as Comrade Cheryl explained, these organisations, nationally based organisations, could, to a certain extent, under conditions of the expansion of capitalism, particularly after the Second World War, gain certain reforms. And these reforms, as Trotsky described, were the kind of the crumbs off the capitalist table were then distributed to the working class to contain the struggle. Now, that was done basically when production was contained very, very much inside the nation state. I mean, you will remember, people will remember that you had nationally based multinational companies, but nationally based companies, which would, you know, organize production from where to go on the national soil. Unions, of course, would, you know, at times of the upsurge of workers demanding better conditions, would then engage in discussions with the management of companies and, you know, to a certain extent, weasel out of them some concessions, which were always short, of course, what the working class required. You know, they could say at that stage, if we do not get some concessions to keep these workers quiet, we will stop production. Now, under the developments of globalized production, where every aspect of of production is internationalized, where production is deaggregated. This can no longer be the case, because basically what the management says to companies now, to unions, and did say in the beginning, well, we'll just move offshore. Now, therefore, the unions have abandoned the programs of national reformism, the crumbs off the capitalist table, and their task will be over the entire last period, particularly from the 80s, the 70s and 80s, has been to dismantle as agencies for capitalism, as political policemen, all the gains of the working class and redirect it towards the owners of big business and corporations. So that's what's changed. It's not, this union official is not tough enough or has not, jumped up and down. This is the fact. They are hostile to the class struggle. So it's the very nature of trade union politics and perspective. So it's not, these unions cannot be, reformed. They cannot be revamped. They cannot be changed by changing the leadership of the union for something that seems more militant or tough, etc. They definitive break must be made. Therefore, working class does require organisation. Therefore, it has to build new organisations which are controlled and headed by the working class, and it has to be on an anti-capitalist programme. It has to be on the programme that removes capitalism and places the economic levers and means of production in the hands of the working class, where they can be utilised for the benefit of all. I just also wanted to remark very briefly on the situation that the questions have been raised over the question of the war in Ukraine. I mean, there's no doubt about this. Look, this was a war that was planned, provoked by NATO. Its aim is to dismantle and dismember Russia, because it has vast resources that they want to get hands on, just as the US and the coalition of willing conducted wars in Iraq on a whole series of lies, of weapons of mass destruction, and then in Libya, etc., and other Middle Eastern countries. Why? To get their hands on vast resources of the Middle East. Now, on the other hand, we have a capitalist class in Russia, as one of the people pointed out. Yes, it's a capitalist class. It was established on the dismantling of the Soviet Union, all the gains of the Soviet Union, and the literal robbery of the state-owned productive forces. An oligarchy exists there, yes, but we have to know how to fight the Russian oligarchs and the capitalist class without capitulating to Western capitalism and imperialism. And we have to know how to fight Western capitalism and imperialism without capitulating and adapting to the Russian capitalist class. In other words, as it is now, as it is, we've been discussing in relationship to the mining industry, the mining deaths, the working class has to have an independent political perspective. We do not, kind of outsource to US imperialism what must be done by the working class. What we fight for, and we quite put the absolutely we fight for, is the unity, establish a unity of the Ukrainian, the Russian working class, the Polish working class, and all those, not under the alliance of NATO, but under an international alliance of solidarity of the working class to intervene. War can only be stopped in this manner. So I just was reading prior to this meeting, I noted there was a mine explosion in Poland that claimed numerous lives. Before that, last November, there was a mine explosion in Russia that also claimed numerous mines. Who are these mines owned by? They're owned by capitalists. They're owned by, you know, the corporate and financial elite, and they subjugate the miners' lives, and they don't care what nationality they are, to this drive for profit. And the same is being done. The Ukrainian working class and people are being used as cannon fodder in a war that they have no interest in. And the Russian working class, you know, is doing this. Putin cannot appeal because he's deeply embedded in capitalism. He represents capitalism to the Ukrainian working class. No more than Zelensky can appeal to the Russian working class. Only a political party that is based on the international unity of the working class and recognizes this class as the revolutionary class that can transform society and put an end to war can do that.
Thanks, Terry. I'll now hand over to Tom, who will make some final remarks in summation and answer, I think, the last question that came through from Sage there. When are we going to ring the bell for mass revolution, and what would that look like? So I'll hand over to you, Tom.
Well, that's a huge question that really requires a whole other meeting to answer, possibly, you know, a whole conference. But you know, I think it's a serious question, and what I would say in response, Sage, is we are in a period of revolution in history. I mean, our movement, the Socialist Equality Parties, the International Committee of the Fourth International, issued a statement at the beginning of 2020 entitled "The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins." So this is not something that we see as being in the far distant future, you know, beyond our lifetimes. Absolutely not, because the working class faces real existential questions, and you know, it cannot live under the current system. That's what we are seeing literally with the pandemic. You're quite right in what you've just said. Announcing that we're in a revolution does not induce change, and I certainly didn't mean to imply that. But to say that we're in a revolutionary period of history, that's not the same as saying that the working class is ready to do that right now or tomorrow or next week. What's required is a massive change in consciousness to align the consciousness of the working class with the tasks that history has created for it, to you know, to abolish capitalism. I think what I tried to say at the end of my speech, you know, we are seeing mass struggles erupt throughout the world, which are only going to get larger. I mean, you know, inflation is totally out of control. People can't afford to feed their families, and that's on top of the dangers of COVID ripping through every school, every workplace, and you know, causing masses of avoidable deaths, as well as the danger of world war. So all of these things are pushing workers into struggle inexorably. But what they don't have is a clear political perspective and organization and knowledge of history, of the history of the working class, of the history of the Russian Revolution and what happened there, how it was betrayed by Stalinism. And, you know, it is, as you say, as you've just said again, it's a question of education, of learning these lessons. And that's the fundamental role of our party. There's no other party that is doing that, that has any intention of doing that, of uniting workers across the world to abolish capitalism. And so what I would say to you, since we don't have time for a week-long discussion of this is to stay in touch with us and to read the World Socialist website, and we can talk more about these issues. And to consider supporting us and joining us in our fight to build this party in New Zealand and throughout the world. I say that to everyone who's listening today. And I think, perhaps that is a good place to end. There was a couple of other questions. I mean, I'm not familiar with this new union that was raised in the comments, but I would just make one point of caution that this has been tried many, many times in New Zealand because the unions are so discredited. I mean, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people flooded out of the unions after their betrayals during the 1980s. And what happened was new unions were formed. They popped up here and there with many of the same people involved. They claimed that they were different, that they had changed, and it was a complete fiction. They remain the same bureaucratic pro-capitalist organizations and more right-wing than ever, and nothing has exposed that as much as the pandemic and the way the unions have herded people into unsafe environments all throughout the world. So what we propose is entirely different from that. I did post a link in the chat earlier to our statement forward to the International Workers' Alliance of rank and file committees on the World Socialist website. I really encourage everyone to read that, which makes the case for a totally different form of organization, one that, as Cheryl was outlining earlier, is actually democratic, is actually controlled by workers. If there had been such an organization at Pike River, a real workers' organization in which workers were able to decide to take action for themselves, then things may have been very different. Of course, one can't say with certainty, but what the role that the EPMU played was to suppress the workers, to ensure that there was no action. Workers tried to fight back. They did walk out of the mine, but they didn't have their own organization to do anything more than that. So that's what's required. Again, this is something that we would be very happy to discuss further with everyone here. So I'll just leave it at that and encourage those listening to buy my book, which is not just my book, it's our book. Many people contributed to it, and to study the lessons of Pike River and our material on the World Socialist website. And yeah, thank everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. I think with those words, we will bring the discussion portion of the meeting to a close. I'd like to again, as Tom said, point everybody to purchase a copy of this book today. You can get it through emailing the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, messaging them on Facebook, or if you're an Australian resident, you can purchase it at mehringbooks.com.au. I would like to thank Tom Peters for his report and answering of the questions, as well as Bernie Monk, although I know he's left, but his contribution, I think, was very critical in the discussion today. Malcolm Bray, thank you very much for your contribution. I know it's early morning in the UK, so thank you. And also Terry Cook, who I think's contribution as well very critically showed above all the need for workers to form their own independent rank and file committees. Just a final announcement, two announcements before we end the meeting. On Sunday, June 12th at 2 p.m, we will be holding a meeting on the recent election in Australia, entitled Australia's Crisis Election, The Way Forward for the Working Class. It's at 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, so I believe that's 4 p.m. New Zealand time. The recent election is a critical experience both in Australia but internationally. While Labor has now won the election, although that wasn't determined until just in the last week, it won less than a third of the overall votes. What has been completely exposed is that the kind of conceptions of Australian exceptionalism, that Australia is somehow exempt from the rule, from international laws, has been blown apart as international developments had a profound impact on the election itself. In particular, the question of the drive to war, the rise of inflation, cost of living, and obviously the COVID-19 pandemic. Our party alone warned that whoever won this election, it will be one of the most right-wing in Australian history. And in the last 2 weeks, that has been proven in spades as Anthony Albanese, the new Prime Minister, immediately after being sworn in, shot off to the Quad meeting with Modi in India, with Biden, Modi, Abe, to really solidify the Australian government's commitment to the US war drive against, in China. Now made, all of a sudden discovered that the economy is in a dire state and that sacrifices, as Chalmers, the Treasurer, made the point, needed to be made. That means war abroad and war at home. So it's a critical meeting. I really encourage everybody to register to attend today. As I said, it's not just of significance in Australia, but also internationally. So that there should be a link in the chat if our tech team can put that in so people can register to join. Finally, I think as Comrade Tom has made clear, we are fighting not to build a new or different union, not to build just another capitalist party, but what is really required, what workers confront in their daily lives, in their workplaces, is the capitalist system itself. And for a fight to be waged against, a genuine fight waged against war, against the barbarity that's unleashed due to COVID-19, the working class needs a socialist perspective and a party. And that party is the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, who is fighting to build a section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. So I really encourage everybody here, as Tom made the point in his final remarks, to make the most important decision of your life and join the Socialist Equality Group. Take up the fight for socialism. Take up the fight for a genuine international anti-war movement that is anti-capitalist in nature, and take forward the fight to free the working class from their shackles. So again, on screen, you'll feel a way to get in contact with us, both through the Socialist Equality New Zealand at gmail.com, through the Facebook, or also through Twitter. Again, these will be posted. If the tech team can post these in chat, that will be important. So with those words, again, I would like to thank all our speakers, thank all of you for attending, for participating, for asking your questions. It's been a very lively and I think very important meeting. So with that, I'll close the meeting. Thank you, everybody.